everyone, and welcome back to the Wisdom by Harry YouTube channel. My name is Harry.
And I'm Mary. We're so excited to have you here today for another fascinating episode. Today, we're going to dive into some really interesting information you shared about a recent trip to the Vatican.
That's right.
Specifically, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance visiting, and crucially, meeting Pope Francis. It's this fascinating mix of, politics and faith.
Absolutely. And our mission here is to sort of unpack what happened and what it might all signify.
Exactly. It's a meeting that, well, it seems loaded with potential meaning, doesn't it?
Especially when you think about the history between them.
Right. This specific meeting was on Easter Sunday, April 20th, 2025. And what really catches the eye is the backdrop, like you said. There have been some, pretty clear disagreements.
Primarily on migration.
Yes, especially regarding the Trump administration's deportation plans. That prior tension, it really frames this whole interaction, I think.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
The Pope has made caring for migrants such a cornerstone of his papacy.
So any meeting with someone holding, say, different views on that becomes pretty significant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the meeting with the Pope on Sunday.
No, that's right. The vice president also went to Good Friday services, and he met with the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin.
So kind of a multifaceted visit.
Definitely. Okay, let's start with that Easter Sunday meeting, the one with the Pope himself.
All right. So this happened at the Domus Santa Marta. That's the Vatican hotel where the Pope actually lives.
And the official reason?
According to the Vatican, it was simply to exchange Easter greetings. Pretty standard diplomatic stuff on the surface.
Okay, but it sounds like it was very, very brief.
Just a few minutes, yeah. That's what the reports indicate.
One detail that sort of stood out was Vance's comment about the Pope's health.
Ah, yes.
Saying something like, I know you haven't been feeling great, but it's good to see you in better health.
Which is quite a human touch, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially given the Pope had just recovered from pneumonia.
It really is. It brings a personal element into what could be just, pure formality.
And apparently the Pope's response was warm. They exchanged happy Easter greetings.
So a cordial start despite any underlying policy differences.
Seems that way. And then there were gifts.
Ah, the gifts. Tell us about those.
Well, the Pope gave Vance 3 large chocolate Easter eggs. For his kids, presumably.
Nice touch.
And a Vatican tie for Vance himself, plus several sets of rosaries. Red for the VP, white for his children, and another white one specifically for his wife.
Wow, that's quite specific and pretty generous, actually.
It is. It acknowledges his family, his faith. Right. The rosaries especially have that religious significance. It feels maybe a bit more personal than just standard diplomatic gifts.
And Vance's reaction.
The reports say he expressed gratitude for the meeting and for the hospitality shown to his family.
And he offered a prayer.
Yes, apparently said something like, I pray for you every day. God bless you. Directly to the Pope.
That's quite a statement, praying every day for the Pope.
It is. It suggests a level of personal respect, maybe trying to bridge that political gap on a more human or spiritual level.
But the whole visit itself, the motorcade part in Vatican territory, was incredibly short.
Just 17 minutes.
17 minutes. What does that tell us?
Well, it strongly implies the meeting was mostly symbolic, right? A brief, personal check-in, not a deep dive into policy.
Yeah, aligns with the Vatican just saying exchanging greetings.
Exactly.
And after that, Vance and his family went to Easter Mass at St. Paul outside the walls.
That's right. And they visited the tomb of St. Paul, too. So a very clear religious dimension to his time in Rome.
Okay, so let's get into that context we mentioned earlier, the disagreements. This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Absolutely. Because Pope Francis, as we said, has consistently championed migrants.
And he was quite vocal back in February, wasn't he? Criticizing deportation plans.
Very much so. He said they deprive people of dignity. Strong words.
And didn't he also sort of address Vance more directly, maybe indirectly, in a letter?
It seems that way.
Yeah.
A letter to U.S. bishops reportedly discussed Catholic doctrine in relation to these kinds of policies.
So essentially challenging the theological justification sometimes used.
Precisely. He seemed to be engaging with the arguments, the principles behind the policies Vance has supported. It's quite pointed, even if indirect.
And how did Vance respond to that criticism?
Well, he acknowledged it, but he also said he'd keep defending his views. So, no backing down there. A clear difference of conviction.
it's fascinating. Vance has described himself as a baby Catholic, too.
Right, at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast, it suggests maybe some humility about his grasp of the faith, or perhaps an awareness of its complexities.
Could be. He's definitely navigating a complex space between his politics and his faith. Now, he's used this concept, ordo amoris.
Yes, ordo amoris, Latin for order of love or hierarchy of care.
How does that work in his argument?
The basic idea is that you have obligations, starting with yourself, family, then community, nation, and so on. Vance used it to argue for prioritizing your own national community's well-being in immigration policy.
Okay. And how does the Pope see ordo amoris?
Well, in that February letter, he offered a very different take. He called it a fraternity open to all, without exception.
Open to all.
Yes, and he specifically brought up the parable of the Good Samaritan. His view emphasizes a universal love and responsibility, extending to everyone, regardless of where they come from.
So a really fundamental disagreement on how to apply that principle? Wow, okay, that really underlines the significance of even a brief Easter meeting.
Definitely.
Now, the day before that, on Saturday the 19th, Vance met with Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican's Secretary of State. That sounds like it might have been a more substantive discussion.
It likely was. According to Vance's office, they talked about shared faith, Catholicism in the U.S., persecuted Christians,
Okay.
and also President Trump's commitment to world peace,
Yeah.
areas where maybe they could find common ground.
But the Vatican's description was maybe a bit broader.
A little, yeah.
Yeah.
They mentioned an exchange of opinions that specifically included migrants and refugees and current conflicts.
So those tricky subjects were probably on the table too.
Seems likely. The Vatican generally tries to be cautious with the Trump administration, They want productive relations, diplomatic neutrality, but they also have their core principles.
And they've expressed concerns before, haven't they?
Oh, yes. Particularly about the crackdowns on migrants, cuts in international aid. They've voiced alarm.
So this Vatican hope for serene collaboration between the state and the U.S. Church. It sounds like a desire for things to be smoother.
It does. Recognizing the Church's work with vulnerable people in the U.S., they'd clearly prefer a more harmonious relationship.
But there's history there, too. Didn't Vance once accuse the U.S. Bishops' Conference of something controversial?
He did. Accuse them of resettling undocumented immigrants for federal funding. That got some very strong pushback from top U.S. cardinals at the time.
Right, so that tension isn't entirely new. And Cardinal Parolin himself said before the visit that the current U.S. administration's approach is very different from the past.
Which is a polite, diplomatic way of saying, yeah, things have changed, and we notice.
It really highlights this complex dance between politics and religion on the world stage. It also makes you think about the longer history here. U.S. presidents and popes meeting isn't exactly new.
Not at all. It goes way back. The first meeting was 1919, Pope Benedict XVI and President Woodrow Wilson.
After World War I, that's quite something.
And since then, lots more. 32 meetings between 6 popes and 14 presidents.
32. That's a significant record of engagement.
And you have key milestones, like JFK, the first Catholic president, meeting Pope Paul VI,
Right.
and Pope John Paul II visiting the White House meeting Jimmy Carter. That was the first time a pope had done that.
So it's a relationship that's evolved and deepened over time. We've seen future popes meet presidents, VPs meeting popes. It's an ongoing dialogue.
Which makes these current interactions, with all their complexities, part of that longer story.
Definitely. Now, shifting back to the immediate events, this all happened over Easter weekend. And for Pope Francis, these Easter celebrations themselves were quite significant this year.
They really were. It was his first major public appearance for Easter since he'd recovered from that bout of pneumonia.
So, seeing him deliver the Urbi et Orbi blessing from St. Peter's Basilica must have felt particularly poignant for many people.
Absolutely. And his message was very focused on peace, wasn't it?
Yes, particularly Gaza and Ukraine. He urged dialogue, protecting the vulnerable.
Called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, release of hostages.
Right, and also spoke out against anti-Semitism, stressed interfaith dialogue. Given everything going on globally and his own health, the message felt powerful.
It did. And his presence at the Easter Vigil Mass on Saturday, greeting people from the Pope Mobile on Sunday, it showed his determination.
And then the news that followed just a day later, Pope Francis passing away on April 21st.
It's just incredible timing. It casts the entire visit in a completely different light.
It really does. Vance reacted to the news, didn't he?
Yes, he said he was happy to see him yesterday, referring to their Easter meeting, but also noted the Pope was obviously very ill.
A very stark observation given what happened next.
He offered condolences, of course. And interestingly, he recalled a specific homily the Pope gave early in the pandemic,
Oh.
described it as really quite beautiful. It suggests, again, maybe a personal resonance beyond just the political figure.
And President Biden called him one of the most consequential leaders of our time.
A sentiment likely shared by many, regardless of their political or religious views. And of course, the funeral arrangements were then announced.
So that brief Easter Sunday meeting, intended perhaps as just a greeting.
It becomes one of the very last personal encounters Pope Francis had with a major world leader. Quite profound, historically speaking.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up, summarize the key takeaways from this deep dive. We had this Easter Sunday meeting, Vance and Pope Francis. Brief, officially just greetings.
Set against this backdrop of really significant disagreements, especially on immigration.
Right. Then there was the meeting with Cardinal Parolin, likely more substantive, touching on shared concerns, but also those points of friction.
And all of this fits into that long history of U.S.-Vatican interactions, highlighting how important and sometimes complicated that relationship is.
You break these sources to us, and I imagine the appeal was precisely that dynamic. The politics, the faith, the differing worldviews colliding.
Hopefully we've managed to unpack some of the layers there, the events, the context, the complexities.
So here's a final thought to leave with our listeners. Considering this long history and the very clear differences in perspective we saw on display here, what might be the longer-term impact of exchanges like these? What does it tell us about how major global players like the US and the Vatican navigate fundamental disagreements about values on the world stage? Something to think about.
Definitely something to consider.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.